Tonight at 10, millions of people will pay more in tax and more for their energy as the Chancellor unveils his plans to tackle the cost of living. Jeremy Hunt says the most vulnerable will be protected as the UK grapples with recession, the highest level of tax since World War II, and the biggest fall in living standards for more than half a century.
I have tried to be fair by following two broad principles. Firstly, we ask those with more to contribute more. And secondly, we avoid the tax rises that damage growth.
The Conservatives have picked the pockets of purses and wallets of the entire country as the Chancellor has deployed a raft of stealth taxes, taking billions of pounds from ordinary working people.
Help with energy bills will be cut back from April. Typical bills will rise from £2,500 to £3,000 a year. But pensions and benefits will go up by more than 10% in line with inflation, and the minimum wage will rise too.
It's all looking positive. I'm quite happy. Yeah, I'm quite overwhelmed actually.
How are we going to make ends meet? How are we going to pay for our bills? How are we going to pay for our gas and electric? I have absolutely no idea.
On BBC London, from schools to social care, find out how the Chancellor's announcement will affect our services. Plus, we get reaction from Londoners about what it means for them.
Good evening. Millions of people will pay more in tax, more for energy bills, and face high inflation as the UK faces a recession. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has unveiled his plans to tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild the economy. He said his priorities were stability, growth, and public services. This is what he announced. Income tax thresholds will be frozen until 2028, meaning as your pay rises, you'll be dragged into higher tax bands. So millions of people will pay more in income tax. Also, anyone earning more than £125,000 a year will now pay the top rate of tax, 45p in a pound, though different rates apply in Scotland. There will be more help with energy bills, but it will be less generous. From April, a typical household will pay £3,000 a year for gas and electricity. The windfall tax on oil and gas companies who've profited from soaring energy prices will rise from 25% to 35% and be extended until 2028. Spending on public services in England will rise more slowly than planned, with some departments facing cuts after the next election. But there will be extra money for schools, the NHS and social care in England for the next 2 years. But there's good news for those on pensions and benefits. They will rise by more than 10% from April in line with inflation. And the national living wage will also rise by more than 9% to £10.42 per hour. Well, the Chancellor said he was having to make difficult decisions to ensure a shallower downturn and blamed the recession on Russia. But Labour said the country's economic challenges have been the result of government mistakes and not just global factors. In a moment, we'll be going through the detail and how it'll affect you with our economics and business editors. But first, here's our political editor, Chris Mason.
It's not even 8 weeks since we reflected on the last Chancellor's big moment, which sent the markets into turmoil and brought down the Prime Minister. 55 days on, under the same governing party, and a colossal change of direction.
Are we all going to be poorer?
Now, it's Jeremy Hunt's turn.
I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Jeremy Hunt!
In the face of unprecedented global headwinds, families, pensioners, businesses, teachers, nurses and many others are worried about the future. So today we deliver a plan to tackle the cost of living crisis and rebuild our economy. Our priorities are stability, growth and public services.
The picture is bleak. The government's independent analysts say living standards are falling by the largest amount for 70 years. Price rises will ease, but the economy is shrinking.
They confirm that our actions today help inflation to fall sharply from the middle of next year. They also judge that the UK, like other countries, is now in recession.
And tax is going up.
I have tried to be fair by following two broad principles. Firstly, we ask those with more to contribute more. And secondly, we avoid the tax rises that damage growth. Although my decisions today do lead to a substantial tax increase, we have not raised headline rates of taxation.
But they have frozen the levels at which we pay various taxes, meaning over time we end up paying much more. And the best paid will be paying a higher rate of income tax. So what about government spending? There'll be less of it overall than had been thought. But listen to this on schools in England.
Because we want school standards to continue to rise for every single child, we're going to do more than protect the school's budget. We're going to increase it.
And on the health service in England,
I will increase the NHS budget in each of the next 2 years by £3.3 billion.
On both health and education, there'll be an equivalent option for an increase for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The state pension will keep pace with the rise in prices, as will all benefits in England, Scotland and Wales. Mr Hunt's concluding claim about his plans was this.
It shows that you don't need to choose either a strong economy or good public services. With Conservatives, and only with Conservatives, you get both. And I commend this statement to the House.
The opposition parties here responded with derision.
The mess we are in is the result of 12 weeks of Conservative chaos, but also 12 years of Conservative economic failure. Growth dismal, investment down, wages squeezed, public services crumbling.
His difficult choices are of nothing compared to what many of our constituents face. The Tories spent the summer squabbling in a leadership contest when they should have been preparing for this difficult winter ahead.
We're talking about 1.2 billion additional for Wales. That actually doesn't touch the sides of what Welsh Government themselves have predicted with the sort of cuts that they will need to make. In real terms, they will be around about £4 billion short in 3 years' time.
Tell me what you've been doing here.
At a school in South London this afternoon, I had the chance to ask Jeremy Hunt the questions you might want answering. Chancellor, what do you say to people tonight who are facing the biggest drop in living standards since the 1950s?
These are real challenges for families up and down the country. I'm not pretending these aren't going to be difficult times, but there's a plan, there's hope, and if we follow this plan, if we stick with it, we can get through to the other side, make the recession shallower than it might otherwise have been, and give hope to families that we can get back to more normality.
In truth, though, you've ducked the difficult decisions, haven't you, until after the next election, when you might be gone?
Well, I've been accused of many things, but ducking difficult decisions.
Postponing some of them.
Well, a Conservative Chancellor standing up in the House of Commons and saying there are going to be £25 billion of tax increases, that is facing up to difficult decisions, but it's facing up to them in a balanced way that recognises that for the next 18 months we are going to be in recession.
Can we ever trust a Conservative politician again who talks about being keen on low taxes? Because we have the highest tax burden for nearly 80 years.
Well, only Conservatives understand that successful economies need to be lightly taxed if they're going to be dynamic and innovative.
You say that, and yet they keep going up.
Yes, because we've had a very exceptional situation. We've had a once-in-a-century pandemic. We've had the fuel price hikes caused by Vladimir Putin.
You are a tax-raising Chancellor presiding over a recession and government spending not what you hoped it would be. Do you have any hope of winning the next election?
Well, Conservatives win elections when they're trusted with the economy. And what you've seen today is a Conservative Chancellor outlining a very difficult path that gets us through this crisis.
A grim picture which many will conclude feels more grim courtesy of today's announcements. But the government wants to try to convince you it's still not as bad as it might have been without their decisions today. Chris Mason, BBC News at Westminster.
So the government's independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, says that once rising prices are taken into account, people's living standards will fall to what they were in 2013, the biggest fall for generations, a decade of prosperity wiped out. Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
Yes, Sophie, an energy shock, a pandemic, an extraordinary mini-budget reversal, multiple changes of Prime Minister and Chancellor. It's quite the backdrop to a very unusual statement. And the big picture is that over a 5-year period, this is effectively 2 budgets in one. And you can see this clearly from totting up the cost of all the taxes and spending changes impacting the economy by year. The pain, the major tax rises and spending cuts actually occur in the last 3 years here. That's the years after a likely general election. And that's designed to impress upon markets that the Chancellor is serious about cutting borrowing after the mini-budget turmoil. But before the election, over here, there is in fact a significant giveaway, especially if you include the energy support bill. £70 billion of support put in by the government before that election takeaway afterwards. Why? Because the Chancellor is very worried about not worsening a recession over here.
It's a budget which gives £100 billion away over the next 2 years to help households with their rising energy bills, helps to take about 2.5 percentage points off a historic peak in inflation, a 40-year high. But then over the medium term, to meet the Chancellor's objective of getting debt falling in 5 years' time, he then takes £40 billion out of borrowing through spending cuts and tax rises in order to meet his objective of getting debt falling by the middle of the decade.
Now, here are those borrowing numbers from today in yellow, as you can see. The key thing is that they're very large and they stay pretty high. Back in March, the official forecasts for government borrowing were much lower and fell. They're in blue. The difference is huge. If you add it all up, it's well over £300 billion in extra borrowing. And remember, this is after all the U-turns, after these tough decisions. And what this shows is the financial pain caused by a massive energy shock, high inflation and higher interest rate costs for the government, topping over £100 billion a year in particular. And during the mini-budget in September, it was not even having numbers like this that was one of the big factors that caused the chaos. Now, this is pretty remarkable too. The proportion of tax we pay will be at the highest level for 3/4 of a century, higher than assumed before the energy crisis. This is down to the government, after the pandemic and the energy crisis, doing more and having to fund it. The burden at first will fall on companies and the more wealthy, but the net will spread more widely after the election. But incredible to think that the mini-budget sought the biggest tax cut in 5 decades, and this is where we are 8 weeks on.
Well, the tax burden is rising really quite fast. What do we mean by the tax burden? The fraction of national income taken in taxes. It's going to reach its highest level essentially in history over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, that's very, very high by UK standards. It's worth saying it's not especially high by Western European standards, but it's a very different structure of the economy going forward.
Now, those forecast tax rises, and to a larger degree, the UK inflation rate, will drive incredible falls in household disposable income. This means a significant reduction in living standards. The 4.3% hit this year is the largest fall since records began in 1956. It's 7%, including next year. That's £1,700 per household over those couple of years. Indeed, this takes living standards back to where they were a decade ago. So that is the pattern, the economic situation causing historic pain to living standards that the government wants to help alleviate now during a recession before the election. But after that, a post-dated cheque on some unspecified spending cuts and tax rises will come. Today will set the terms of trade for both Conservatives and Labour for the next half-decade. Sophie.
Faisal, thank you. Well, the rising cost of energy has been at the heart of this cost of living crisis, and the Chancellor announced that help with bills would be extended next year, but it would be less generous. Our business editor, Simon Jack, has been looking through the plans. Simon.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, some big changes coming. Worth perhaps having a look at the current help available for energy bills. With the government's energy price guarantee, the unit cost of energy is capped so that typical household would spend around £2,500 annually. But if you use more energy, you pay more. Now, currently, every household is receiving a discount on their bills of £400, spread up £66 a month between October and March next year, with further support available for people on low incomes. Today, the government has announced that it will reduce energy support from April next year. Millions of households will pay more for their energy, with typical household bills rising to £3,000. And that universal £66 monthly payment will come to an end in April, to be replaced by more targeted support for the most vulnerable, including £900 for people on means-tested benefits, £300 for pensioners and £150 for people on disability benefit. Now, that won't help people like Daniel Cook, who won't qualify for extra support, but who's had to take on a second job in the evenings to pay the bills.
We've been able to almost survive with the assistance that's come through from the government. With this, that's almost going to be taken away from us through no fault of our own, is a very frightening, very worrying, very scary time for us as a young family. How are we going to make ends meet? How are we going to pay for our bills? How are we going to pay for our gas and electric? I have absolutely no idea.
Now, there have been calls for energy companies making big profits from the current high global energy prices to pay more tax. Back in May, there was a one-off tax imposed on energy company profits, the windfall tax. That was raised to 25%. Today, the Chancellor said that would go up again to an extra 35% from next January, and it would be expanded to include other electricity generators and last till January 2028. Now, Jeremy Hunt said together those expected measures would raise £14 billion next year alone. But companies and business groups say it could deter vital investment in renewables.
There will be some concerns that the new levy on electricity generation might mean we see less investment in renewable energy, whereas I think what businesses and what people generally want to see is an increase in our investment in renewable energy. That's the only way out of the energy crisis that we face over the long term.
Now, one thing that was missing today was any detail on how much support businesses will get with their energy bills from April next year. More detail was promised, but few firms will feel confident enough to invest and grow with that kind of uncertainty hanging over them. Sophie.
Simon, thank you. So what does it all mean for the NHS, schools and social care? In a moment, we'll hear from our social affairs editor, Alison Holt, and education editor, Branwen Jeffries. But first, here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
There is some relief among NHS leaders in England. They had feared they'd be told to stick to their previously agreed budget of £157 billion for next year. They were worried inflation would eat into that and they might even have to cut some services. But the Chancellor has allocated an extra £3.3 billion for next year and the year after. And there'll be proportionate funding increases for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Health leaders have indicated they can work with that. But there are uncertainties. What if inflation's higher than expected? What about the pay bill? If staff vacancies are still hard to fill, what does that mean for the costs of agency workers? And what if COVID is worse than anticipated? For the NHS this winter and beyond, these are very difficult times.
For those who need help with day-to-day living, whether it's in their own home or in a care home, today's statement may ease some of the immediate problems of getting help from a care system in crisis, but it also delays long-promised support for those who face so-called catastrophic costs. The plan to cap or limit the amount of money that any one person pays towards their care in England to £86,000 was due to come in next year. It will now be delayed for more than 2 years. Sir Andrew Dilnot, who devised the cap more than a decade ago, describes that as extraordinarily disappointing, saying that vulnerable people will not have certainty about how their care will be funded. The Chancellor says the care sector will be able to keep the money earmarked for reform and local authorities will be able to raise more money through council tax. He calculates that up to £2.8 billion extra will be raised for social care next year, £4.7 billion the year after. But the key words here are up to. It's unlikely all councils will want to raise council tax to the maximum at a time when families are struggling to pay their bills.
Schools in England are getting extra cash, £2.3 billion a year for the next 2 years. Once you take into account all the rising costs, That means that by 2024, the amount being spent on each pupil will be at least where it was in 2010. But head teachers don't yet know what the pay increase is going to be for their staff next year. But I'm standing in a further education college and there's no extra money for the education of 16 to 19-year-olds. Today, the government stressed the importance of skills to our economy. But in colleges like this that deliver a lot of skills training, the amount being spent per student by 2024 will still be significantly lower than it was a decade ago. There's no extra money for early years either, even though nurseries and childminders are also facing rising costs. Instead, the government wants to look at whether it should allow each member of staff to look after more 2-year-olds in order to lower the overheads.
Bramwyn Jeffries there. Well, there were many other announcements and spending pledges made by the Chancellor today. Here are a few of them. Local authorities in England will be able to increase their council tax bills by up to 5%. The vast majority are expected to do that, and the money will go towards social care. If you have an electric car, you'll have to tax it from 2025. At the moment, electric cars are exempt. Major infrastructure projects such as Northern Powerhouse Rail, HS2 and the nuclear power plant at Sizewell C will continue to be built. The overseas aid budget will be kept at 0.5% of national income, short of the government's 0.7% original target. And the defence budget will be kept at 2% of GDP. Jeremy Hunt said his plans would protect those on low incomes and the most vulnerable in society, with a rise in the living wage and a cap on rents for social housing. Michael Buchanan has spent the day in Southend getting reaction to the Chancellor's plans.
6:30 a.m. and lecturer Adam Weaver is preparing breakfast.
There you go.
Before heading out for an early meeting at his further education college. Each day, it seems, brings a new financial challenge for the father of 3.
This morning getting the train, that's going to cost me £3 more than what it would cost me if I got it after 9:30, so I'll change what I have for lunch.
As Adam heads out, he has little hope in the Chancellor's statement. Public sector wages, after all, have been squeezed for a decade. Over the road, Wendy Wilson is opening the local cafe. 2 months ago, rising prices forced her to give up her dogs. The pressure hasn't relented. Even her son's offering to help.
His pocket money, I give him on the 14th of every month, and he wanted to give some back to me for the cost of the electrics, because he knows I'm struggling. So for a little 11-year-old boy to understand, it's quite sad.
Clooney Square is home to high numbers of low-income families, many solely or partially dependent on benefits. The autumn statement really matters, therefore. Inflation for people here is higher than average, as they spend more of their money on food and energy. Wendy will be better off due to the rise in benefits and the minimum wage, the cap on social housing rents, and receive a £900 cost of living payment next year.
Yeah, I'm quite overwhelmed, actually. You know, the minimum wage is going to help, and the benefits, just that rise, because it meet what's going on in the shops.
At the Chippy, Jack Von Looy was serving the last of the lunchtime rush. He says the minimum wage rise he'll get won't make much difference.
Yeah, it's only going to get worse. I don't see it getting much better. It's still only a small jump considering the big jump in the increase in bills, though, isn't it?
As expected, Adam didn't benefit personally from the statement, but he was still broadly supportive.
I think it's much fairer than the last announcement. My personal hope is that, you know, it'll balance out the situation with mortgages.
55 days after a mini-budget that dismayed those on low incomes, today many feel more positive, hopeful even. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Southend.
Well, let's assess the impact across the UK. In a moment, we'll hear from Thomas Morgan in Cardiff and Emma Vardy in Belfast. But first, let's go to our Scotland editor, James Cook, in Glasgow.
The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, says his decision to increase
public spending on health and education in England means there will be an extra £1.5 billion available for the Scottish Government's budget over 2 years, although the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says that money is being swallowed up by inflation, and she accuses the Conservatives of reimposing austerity. Now, it'll be up to the Acting Finance Secretary John Swinney to decide how to spend the money he does have, and that will happen next month. He'll also have to decide whether or not to replicate some of the big tax changes in Mr Hunt's statement. Now, some of what the Chancellor set out does apply here, including, for example, the increases in pensions and in some benefits. On the issue of a windfall tax, well, there is some support for that in parts of Scotland, but in the northeast of the country in particular, there is concern that it might affect investment in the North Sea, including in renewable energy.
One of the problems facing Northern Ireland at the moment is that there's a big black hole in public finances. Some £660 million has been overspent on public services due to the cost of so many things going up. And there's no functioning government in place here either at the moment to help tackle it. Today, the Chancellor said that Northern Ireland would be getting an extra £650 million of cash in the funding it gets from central government. So that might ease the pressure here a bit, but it doesn't completely balance the books as it's spread over 2 years. Now, there was another key announcement today aimed at the many homes in Northern Ireland who use heating oil. The £100 grant they were due to get has been doubled to £200 and is in fact now being given to all households on top of the £400 they're due to receive to help take the edge off those high household heating bills this winter.
According to the ONS, if we compare the 4 home nations, Wales receives the highest amount of state support. So the decision today to raise benefits in line with inflation and keep the pension triple lock will no doubt be a small comfort for some during this cost of living crisis. However, the decision by Jeremy Hunt to keep public sector spending the same for the next 2 years, well, that hasn't gone down so well with the Welsh Labour government. The finance minister here saying that people will be spending more for less as public sector budgets are squeezed by inflation. Now, Wales, along with Scotland and Northern Ireland, will get some extra funding, £1.2 billion here over the next 2 years. However, the Welsh government say they're down £1.5 billion compared to last year. And they're blaming that on the same thing that's affecting so many other things in our economy at the moment, the rise in inflation.
Thomas Morgan there, our political editor. Chris Mason is in Westminster. So after the turmoil of the last few months, will the Chancellor's plans be enough to steady things for a bit?
I think in party political terms there is a fair chance of that, not because Conservatives or indeed any other political party are particularly comfortable about cranking up taxes and spending less than they had intended to, but more because of what's happened in the last few months. The Conservatives standing on the edge of the precipice and contemplating oblivion and then concluding that frankly any other option was probably better, and so the appetite for insurrection and civil war has died down a bit. But to be honest, in truth, the fate of this political party or that tonight matters far less than the reality for millions of households who felt squeezed for a long time already and are likely to be squeezed for several more years yet. And the judgment on what we've heard today will be, does it make a bad situation not quite as bad, or does it make it worse? And the big political argument to come is who can be seen to be a competent and trustworthy custodian of very, very difficult times.
Our political editor, Chris Mason, thank you. And there is more detail and analysis of the autumn statement, including what it means for you, on our website. That's bbc.co.uk/news, and you can find it all in our Cost of Living Tackling It Together section on the website. A look now at some other stories making the news today. A Dutch court has found 3 men guilty of murder for shooting down the MH17 plane over eastern Ukraine in 2014, killing 298 people. The trial took place without any of the defendants being present. All 3 men convicted are believed to be in Russia, which will not extradite them. About 350 ground handling staff at Heathrow Airport employed by Menzies will begin a 3-day strike starting tomorrow in a dispute over pay, says the Unite Union. The action will impact flights in Terminals 2, 3 and 4. Heathrow says it shouldn't lead to flights being cancelled. 6 more days of strike action by Royal Mail workers have been announced. The Communication Workers Union says its members will walk out on the 9th, 11th, 14th, 15th 23rd and 24th of December as part of a dispute over pay and conditions. England and Wales play their first World Cup matches in Qatar on Monday. The players have been trying to acclimatise to the heat in Doha, as Hal Griffith reports.
This may be a winter World Cup, but in the desert city of Doha, temperatures are unseasonably hot. So sweltering, Wales delayed their first training session by 2.5 hours. As tournament newbies, there's a lot of acclimatising to be done.
I'm not used to weather like this, being from obviously Wales. We went for a walk about 11 o'clock and just walking around the streets, I was just sweating, just walking. So we were all thinking, oh, imagine what it's going to be like training.
Some, though, are already managing to chill out.
The supporters who are coming here are in for a very different tournament experience, and not just because of the weather. There are 32 countries all playing in one city. And the authorities are trying to keep everything tightly controlled.
We are live on Danish television.
Security guards tried to take this Danish journalist off air as he broadcast live. Qatar's Supreme Committee later apologised. Sensitive subjects are being raised. Earlier, England's players met a group of migrant workers. They've also discussed the rights of gay and lesbian fans.
We've come to a country where we'll respect rules and respect everything that goes on in this country. And listen, we're all here for one thing, and that's to play football. But in terms of what we believe in as a team and what we believe in as players, and that's football for all and everybody to be included in our great sport, yeah.
In this tournament, cultures as well as countries will collide. Concerns over bringing the World Cup to Qatar are far from over. Howell Griffith, BBC News, Doha.
Time now for a look at the weather here. Here's Sarah Keith-Lucas.
Thanks, Sophie. It's been a mixed weather picture out there today. It's been drying up in the south, but we have had rain pushing northwards. I think it was nice weather for ducks today in Barnsley a little bit earlier on. Now, if we take a look at where we're expecting the rain over the next 24 hours, this is the expected accumulation of rain. Not too much around parts of southern England, Wales, up towards Northern Ireland, but just look at those green colours across the east of Scotland. That's where the rain's going to be really heavy and persistent. In fact, the Met Office have issued an amber warning for heavy rain across parts of Aberdeenshire, Angus, parts of Perth and Kinross. These areas could see 100 millimetres or more of rain, and that is going to lead to some potential flooding issues. Elsewhere, we have still got some wet weather around because this area of low pressure is drifting its way northwards. And with the winds rotating around that area of low pressure, they're driving that rain into northeast England and eastern Scotland overnight. Elsewhere, a few showers around, but drier and clearer conditions the further south and west you are. And most of us frost-free to start off Friday morning, but temperatures have already got down to freezing across western parts of Northern Ireland. They'll rise through the morning. So this is how Friday is shaping up then. We've got that persistent rain for eastern Scotland drifting its way further west through the day. 1 or 2 showers for the likes of Dumfries and Galloway into northwest England as well. But elsewhere, clearer, drier weather and temperatures only around about 9 to 12 degrees, so certainly not as warm as it has been recently. So heading through Friday evening, still some rain lingering close to the east coast here. Most of other areas tending to dry out. But what we're going to see heading through into Saturday is that front just sitting close to the east coast and then another front trying to squeeze in from the west. So in between there will be some dry weather. Could be some frost and fog around early on Saturday. But most of us will see a little bit of cloud, some outbreaks of rain perhaps at times. And it's certainly going to be feeling colder than it has done recently. Sophie.
Sarah, thank you. And there's more analysis of the day's stories on Newsnight with Victoria Derbyshire, which is getting underway right now on BBC Two. The news continues here on BBC One because it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Good night.